The war between the United States and Iran began on February 28, 2026. On that day, a coalition of American forces launched a series of surprise airstrikes. On that day, a coalition of Israeli forces launched a series of surprise airstrikes. These attacks targeted multiple strategic sites and major cities across the Iranian landscape. The initial barrage resulted in the death of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, and several other high-ranking Iranian officials. This decisive action immediately escalated long-simmering tensions into open conflict. As of today, March 25, 2026, the war has now entered its 25th day. The path forward remains shrouded in uncertainty. There is no clear or immediate end in sight. In response to the initial coalition attacks, Iran retaliated. The nation launched a barrage of missile strikes and drone strikes. Targets included American military bases across the Middle East, key Israeli locations, and other allied countries in the region. The retaliation broadened the conflict's scope significantly. Fighting has reignited dormant conflicts, most notably clashes between Israel. The economic consequences have been swift and severe. Iran moved quickly to shutter the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow Gulf waterway critical to global energy shipments. That closure triggered a catastrophic disruption in international oil markets. Global oil prices have risen roughly 45% since the war began. Crude has surged past $110 per barrel, straining economies worldwide. The human and logistical toll is mounting. The Persian Gulf has become a parking lot for commercial vessels. More than 3,000 ships are stranded, unable to move their cargo. The United Nations estimates about $63 billion in regional losses so far. Disruptions to fuel supply chains and fertilizer supply chains are pushing global food prices higher. The conflict's impact is growing more complex by the day. President Trump suggested the U.S. is getting very close to meeting our objectives and considering winding down military efforts. The Trump administration's temporary lifting of some oil sanctions until April 19th suggests sensitivity to economic pressures. Pakistan has offered to host peace talks between the U.S. and Iran. Iran has rejected a 15-point U.S. ceasefire proposal as extremely maximalist and unreasonable. Tehran has presented 5 conditions, including war reparations and sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. A short war, lasting only a few more weeks, remains a possibility, though it depends on several critical factors aligning quickly. This scenario would most likely be triggered by a rapid diplomatic breakthrough. President Trump has projected a 4 to 5 week operation, and this timeline could be met if the United States declares its primary objectives achieved. These objectives might be framed as sufficiently weakening Iran's military capabilities or degrading its nuclear program. If Washington made such a declaration, it could create an opening for a cessation of hostilities without needing to achieve a total military victory or force a regime change. For a short war to materialize, Iran would also need to show a willingness to de-escalate. This might involve accepting a modified ceasefire agreement, perhaps brokered by a neutral third party like Pakistan. The Iranian leadership has rejected a 15-point U.S. proposal as unreasonable, but intense international pressure and mounting economic and military costs could force them to reconsider. If mediators can bridge the gap between Iran's 5 conditions for peace and American demands, a deal could be struck. The key is finding a face-saving solution for both sides that allows the fighting to stop. The global economic fallout could be a powerful catalyst for a swift resolution. Severe disruption to oil supplies and the stranding of thousands of ships have put immense pressure on the world economy. Allies in Europe, allies in Asia, China, France. A more likely scenario, according to many analysts, is a medium-length war that continues for roughly 2 months. This outcome aligns with predictions from Oxford Economics. It would persist beyond optimistic timelines, but stop short of a protracted quagmire. Not necessarily ending with a decisive victory or a comprehensive peace treaty. Rather, it would wind down through mutual exhaustion, lower-intensity strikes, counterstrikes, and intensifying back-channel diplomacy. Difficulty reconciling the opposed war aims of the United States and Iran is the key driver. Conflicting statements from Washington. If the goal goes beyond degrading Iran's military to fundamentally altering its regional behavior, it will take more time. Iran does not simply want a ceasefire. It wants the war to end on its own terms, demanding war reparations and sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, demands the U.S. is unlikely to accept quickly. The fighting would settle into a grinding rhythm. U.S. strikes on Iranian military targets would continue, but less frequently, as high-value targets diminish. Thousands of additional Marines would deploy, thousands of Army troops would deploy to secure U.S. positions. U.S. officials report Iranian missile and drone attacks are down 90% from their peak. That could mean Iran's capacity to strike has been severely degraded, or its leadership is deliberately reducing the intensity of its response. Either way, the reduction in hostilities could be seized as an opportunity to wind down military efforts. If the U.S. concludes it has demonstrated military superiority and neutralized the most immediate threats, it may opt for a rapid withdrawal from major combat operations. Suggests sensitivity to economic pressures that could be leveraged to push for a faster end. A flexible approach that links military de-escalation to economic incentives could create a pathway to peace. After weeks more fighting, U.S. aims might be declared met. Iran could claim it defended its sovereignty. Both sides can spin this as victory, enabling a fragile negotiated truce to end major combat operations. The most dangerous scenario is that of a long war, one that could last for many months or even longer. This outcome would occur if the conflict's objectives expand, particularly if the United States commits to full-scale regime change in Tehran. Such a goal would almost certainly require a major ground invasion and a subsequent occupation, a massive undertaking that would transform the conflict into a protracted and bloody affair. Military analysts have noted that if boots on the ground become a central part of the U.S. strategy, the timeline would stretch indefinitely. In response, Iran could further activate its network of regional proxies, leading to a wider conflagration that draws in more countries. The fighting between Israel and Hezbollah could intensify into a full-blown war. Iraq, new fronts; Syria, new fronts; Yemen, new fronts, creating a chaotic, region-wide conflict. The economic consequences of a prolonged conflict would be devastating. A war lasting many months would keep the Strait of Hormuz closed indefinitely, crippling global energy markets and potentially triggering a deep global recession. The cost of oil would likely climb far higher than current levels, and the disruption to shipping and trade would become systemic. The estimated $63 billion in regional economic losses would multiply many times over, destabilizing governments across the Middle East. Global food shortages, global energy shortages, and the political will among U.S. allies to support the war effort would likely fracture under the immense economic strain. Domestic political factors could also contribute to a longer war. While current polling shows that only 1 in 4 Americans supports the attacks on Iran, a major attack by Iran that causes mass U.S. casualties could galvanize public opinion in favor of a stronger, more sustained military response. Conversely, if Iran's government feels its very survival is at stake, it will have little incentive to negotiate an end to the conflict. It would likely choose to fight to the bitter end. To understand which direction the war is heading, we must watch several key signals closely. The first and most important is the nature of diplomatic communication. While Iran has publicly rejected U.S. ceasefire proposals, the fact that messages are being exchanged through mediators is a vital sign. The tenor of these messages matters, and the willingness of either side to soften its public demands will be the clearest indicator of whether a resolution is possible. The efforts of international mediators are critical: China, France, Pakistan. If these nations can formulate a peace plan that addresses the core security concerns of both the U.S. and Iran, it could provide the diplomatic off-ramp needed to end the fighting. The third, the global economic response will continue to shape the war's duration. Oil prices are a real-time barometer of the conflict's perceived risk. If prices continue to climb and supply disruptions worsen, the pressure on the White House from allies and domestic constituencies will intensify. President Trump's statements about being very close to meeting our objectives and considering winding down military efforts may be, in part, a response to this economic pressure. The willingness of the U.S. to use economic relief, such as the temporary sanctions waiver, as a tool for negotiation will be crucial. A flexible approach that links military de-escalation to economic incentives could create a pathway to peace. Ultimately, the war's duration will be determined by the political calculations made in Washington and Tehran. A short war is possible if leaders prioritize economic stability and limited military goals. A medium-length conflict seems plausible as both sides grapple with irreconcilable demands before settling for a costly stalemate. A long war remains a terrifying possibility, driven by mission creep and a cycle of escalation. The diplomatic channels, however fragile, offer the only real hope for preventing the worst-case scenario. The willingness of both sides to eventually choose talking over fighting will determine how and when this devastating conflict finally comes to an end. The path this war takes will be defined by whether the goals remain limited or expand into an existential struggle.